At the moment, Janet, the market is closely following, of course, stimulus, expecting more from central banks, and kind of ignoring the lockdowns, ignoring the fact that vaccination rollouts could be slow. What kind of general world recovery are you expecting?
Well, I think that the financial markets are obviously focused on the idea that we're going to get more stimulus and a bigger reopening, and that even if things are bad in the short term, if anything, that means we'll get even more stimulus. So I'd say the recovery that we're looking at is that we've started the year on a softer footing, particularly in Europe, because much of Europe seems to have gone back into recession. But pretty much everywhere, we've seen some softening of GDP across much of the world. India's probably the only exception where things might have revived. And then through the course of the year, we've got something that's looking increasingly uneven and to some degree being influenced by the pace of vaccination rollouts and by domestic stimulus packages. And even within economies, the pace of reopening will depend on what is happening globally. We know that international travel, for instance, isn't going to resume. So those economies that are more dependent on that will be held back further. So, yeah, we are looking for some degree of bounce back, but perhaps aren't quite as optimistic on the recovery, because even this short-term damage will have lasting implications.
I mean, a bounce back, Janet, once enough people are vaccinated, are we back to normal, or do you have questions about that?
In the short term, we know that there are some disruptions, even across Europe. We can see that, it's not just Israel, where there's over 40% of the population already vaccinated. In the UK, it's about 10%. In the US, it's over 6%. But in Europe, it's less than 2% in the major economies. And some countries, it's going to be very late in 2021. And in some of the poorest countries, it could even be 2022. So the later the vaccinations come through, then the greater those economies will be at risk to even more new strains that might materialize. And of course, not everyone will necessarily take the vaccinations. So, yeah, it matters. It's vitally important. As hospitalizations come down and importantly, death rates come down, more restrictions can be eased. But it will mean that, it's not suddenly going to be one day everything returns to normal. It's going to be more spread out and more staggered.